Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she organized medical supplies in the cramped military field tent. The desert heat was unbearable, even with the fans running constantly. She had been working as a civilian nurse contractor for 6 months now, treating wounded soldiers at Forward Operating Base Alpha in Afghanistan. The pay was good, but more importantly, she felt like she was making a real difference. At 28 years old, Sarah had already seen more trauma than most emergency room nurses back home in Texas. She had volunteered for this assignment after her younger brother died in a car accident. The grief had consumed her, and she needed something meaningful to fill the emptiness. Helping wounded soldiers seemed like the right path. The medical tent was always busy. Soldiers came in with everything from minor cuts to serious injuries from roadside bombs. Sarah worked alongside Dr. Peterson, an Army medic named Jackson, and 2 other civilian nurses. They had become a tight team, working long hours to save lives in difficult conditions. Sarah preferred to work quietly. She never talked much about her past or why she had come to Afghanistan. The other staff respected her privacy, though they often wondered about the sadness that sometimes showed in her eyes. She was incredibly skilled at her job, often anticipating what the doctors needed before they asked. Her hands were steady during the most stressful situations, and she had a gentle way with the wounded soldiers that helped calm their fears. The base was located in a dangerous area where Taliban attacks were common. Every day brought new challenges and new patients. Sarah had learned to push down her emotions and focus on the work. She treated each wounded soldier with the same care she would have wanted for her own brother. Colonel James Morrison commanded the base. He was a career military man in his 40s, respected by his troops and known for his fair leadership. He often visited the medical tent to check on wounded soldiers. Sarah had spoken to him only a few times, brief conversations about patient care. He seemed like a good man who genuinely cared about his people. The base housed about 300 soldiers, mostly young men and women who were far from home and family. They relied on each other for support and protection. The medical tent served as a lifeline for those who were injured during patrols and combat operations. Sarah took pride in being part of that lifeline. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning equipment after a particularly busy day, she overheard 2 soldiers talking about an upcoming mission. It sounded dangerous, involving a remote village where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were hiding weapons. The soldiers seemed nervous but determined to complete their assignment. Sarah had learned not to get too emotionally involved with individual soldiers. It was too painful when they were seriously injured or killed. But she couldn't help caring about these young people who risked their lives every day. She often wondered about their families back home, waiting and worrying. The medical tent was equipped with basic surgical equipment, blood supplies, and pain medications. More serious cases had to be evacuated by helicopter to larger medical facilities. Sarah had seen too many soldiers loaded onto helicopters, some who would never return to their families. It was the hardest part of her job. Dr. Peterson often praised Sarah's work, telling her she was one of the best nurses he had worked with in his 15-year military career. But Sarah never felt like she was doing enough. The war seemed endless, and the stream of wounded soldiers never stopped. She sometimes questioned whether her presence really made a difference. The other nurses, Maria and Jennifer, had become good friends. They often ate dinner together and shared stories about home. Sarah joined them sometimes, but usually preferred to spend her free time alone reading or writing letters to her parents. She found it difficult to form close relationships since losing her brother. The base had been relatively quiet for the past week, which made everyone nervous. In their experience, quiet periods usually meant the enemy was planning something big. Colonel Morrison had increased security patrols and reminded everyone to stay alert. The medical staff prepared for the possibility of mass casualties. Sarah's living quarters were basic but comfortable. She shared a small building with the other civilian nurses. Each had a tiny room with a bed, desk, and storage space. The shared bathroom and common area allowed for some privacy, while maintaining the camaraderie needed for morale. She kept a photo of her brother on her desk, along with letters from her parents. Her mother wrote every week, sharing news from home and begging Sarah to be careful. Her father, a retired police officer, understood better why she had chosen this path. He was proud of her service but worried constantly about her safety. The soldiers at the base had nicknamed Sarah Angel because of her gentle manner with patients. She was embarrassed by the nickname, but understood it was meant with respect and affection. Many soldiers had been helped by her skilled care during their most vulnerable moments. As the sun set over the desert, Sarah prepared for another night shift. The medical tent operated around the clock with staff rotating to ensure continuous coverage. Night shifts were often busier because enemy attacks typically happened after dark. Sarah checked supplies, reviewed patient charts, and mentally prepared herself for whatever the night might bring. The generator hummed outside the tent, providing power for lights and medical equipment. The sounds of the base settling into night mode were familiar now. Soldiers talking quietly, equipment being checked, and the occasional radio chatter from the command center. Sarah felt a strange sense of peace in this routine, despite being thousands of miles from home in a war zone. Little did she know that the next few days would test her in ways she never imagined, and that her actions would save lives in a manner that would remain secret, until one man decided the truth needed to be told. The alarm sounded at 3 a.m, jolting Sarah awake from a restless sleep. She could hear shouting, and the sound of vehicles moving quickly across the base. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her uniform and rushed to the medical tent. This wasn't a drill, something serious was happening. Dr. Peterson was already there, along with Jackson and the other nurses. They were preparing for casualties, laying out surgical instruments and checking blood supplies. The radio crackled with urgent communications from the command center. A patrol of 12 soldiers had been ambushed while returning from the village mission. Sarah had overheard them discussing days earlier. Multiple casualties incoming, Jackson announced grimly. Helicopter ETA is 15 minutes. We need to be ready for everything. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She helped prepare IV bags, organized trauma supplies, and cleared space for stretchers. Her hands moved efficiently despite the fear building in her chest. She had been through this before, but it never got easier. The helicopter arrived with a thunderous roar, landing just outside the medical tent. Soldiers rushed to unload the wounded as Sarah and her team prepared to receive them. The first patient was Sergeant Williams, a young man Sarah had treated for a minor infection just weeks earlier. Now he was unconscious with severe injuries to his legs and abdomen. One by one, the wounded soldiers were brought in. The medical tent became chaos as the team worked frantically to stabilize patients and assess injuries. Sarah moved between patients, starting IVs, taking vital signs, and assisting Dr. Peterson with emergency procedures. The smell of blood and antiseptic filled the air. 2 soldiers had died in the helicopter on the way back. 4 others had serious injuries requiring immediate evacuation to the larger medical facility. The remaining 6 had wounds that could be treated at the base, though some would require surgery. Sarah noticed that several soldiers from the patrol hadn't been brought in, which meant they were either uninjured or still out there. As the team worked through the night, Sarah learned more about what had happened. The patrol had been returning from their mission when they triggered a roadside bomb. The explosion had disabled their vehicle and left them exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. Some soldiers were trapped under debris, while others were pinned down by continuous gunfire. Colonel Morrison arrived at the medical tent as they were preparing the most seriously wounded for helicopter evacuation. His face was grim as he spoke quietly with Dr. Peterson about the casualties. Sarah overheard him mention that a rescue team was being organized to extract the remaining soldiers, who were still trapped at the ambush site. "Sir, we've got 4 soldiers still out there," Jackson reported to the colonel. "Radio contact is intermittent. Last report suggested they're barricaded in a damaged building, but enemy forces have them surrounded." The colonel's jaw tightened. These were his men, and Sarah could see the weight of command in his eyes. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers under his protection. The rescue mission would be extremely dangerous, potentially putting more lives at risk. Sarah continued working on the wounded soldiers throughout the night. Private Johnson, barely 19 years old, had shrapnel wounds across his back and arms. He kept asking about his buddies who were still trapped. Sarah tried to reassure him while cleaning his wounds, but she could see the fear and guilt in his young eyes. "They saved my life," Johnson whispered to Sarah as she bandaged his arm. "When the bomb went off, Corporal Davis pushed me away from the vehicle. I should have stayed to help them." Sarah knew survivors' guilt well. She had experienced it after her brother's accident, constantly wondering if she could have done something differently. She held Johnson's hand and told him he wasn't responsible for what happened. Sometimes surviving meant living to fight another day. The radio in the command center crackled with updates about the rescue mission. Sarah tried not to listen, focusing instead on her patients, but she couldn't help worrying about the soldiers still trapped. The enemy forces seemed to be well positioned and heavily armed, making any rescue attempt extremely risky. Dr. Peterson pulled Sarah aside during a brief quiet moment. "We may have more casualties coming in soon," he said quietly. "The rescue team is moving out in 2 hours. I want you to prepare additional surgical supplies and make sure we have enough blood products ready." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. The rescue mission could result in even more wounded soldiers being brought to their already strained medical facility. She began organizing supplies and checking equipment, making mental notes of what they might need. As dawn approached, the medical tent had stabilized all the wounded soldiers who had been brought in. 2 had been evacuated to the larger medical facility, while the others would recover at the base. Sarah felt exhausted but couldn't rest knowing that 4 soldiers were still in danger. Colonel Morrison returned to check on the wounded soldiers before the rescue mission launched. He spoke quietly with each patient, offering words of encouragement and promising to bring their friends home safely. When he reached Private Johnson, the young soldier grabbed his arm. "Sir, they're in the old schoolhouse at the north end of the village," Johnson said urgently. "That's where I last saw them taking cover. But sir, there were a lot of enemy fighters. Maybe 20 or more surrounding the building." The colonel thanked Johnson for the information and made notes. Sarah watched as he prepared to leave, knowing he was about to risk more lives to save the trapped soldiers. It was an impossible decision, but one that military leaders had to make in war. The rescue team consisted of 2 squads of experienced soldiers, along with combat medics and heavy weapon support. Sarah watched through the tent opening as they loaded into armored vehicles and prepared to leave the base. The sun was just beginning to rise over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Radio communications with the trapped soldiers had become more sporadic. The last message indicated they were running low on ammunition and had at least 1 seriously wounded man among them. Time was running out, and the rescue team needed to reach them before enemy forces could overrun their position. Sarah felt helpless as she watched the rescue convoy disappear into the distance. All she could do was wait and prepare for whatever casualties might result from this dangerous mission. She had no way of knowing that within hours, she would face a choice that would test every skill she possessed and every ounce of courage she could find. 2 hours after the rescue team departed, Sarah was restocking medical supplies when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. But something was wrong. The helicopter was coming from the wrong direction, and radio chatter suggested it wasn't part of the planned rescue operation. The aircraft that landed was a small reconnaissance helicopter with critical mechanical problems. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Kate Riley, rushed into the medical tent with urgent news. During her surveillance mission, she had spotted the rescue convoy under heavy attack just 3 miles from the village. The armored vehicles were disabled, and the rescue team was now trapped alongside the original patrol. "We have approximately 16 soldiers pinned down at 2 separate locations," Officer Riley reported breathlessly to anyone who would listen. "The main rescue team is stuck in a ravine about half a mile from where the original patrol is trapped. Enemy forces have them completely surrounded. My bird took damage from ground fire. I can't get back in the air." Dr. Peterson immediately got on the radio to inform Colonel Morrison at the command center, but the news was devastating. The colonel's voice was tense as he acknowledged the report. The base's remaining forces were insufficient for another large rescue operation, and calling for backup would take hours that the trapped soldiers didn't have. Sarah listened to the radio communications with growing alarm. 16 soldiers were now trapped and under constant enemy fire. Medical supplies were running low for both groups, and at least 3 soldiers were seriously wounded according to the last radio contact. Time was running out fast. "There has to be something we can do," Sarah said to Dr. Peterson as they discussed the impossible situation. The doctor looked defeated, explaining that military protocol required waiting for reinforcements. Any unauthorized rescue attempt would be considered reckless and could result in court-martial, but Sarah couldn't accept that answer. These weren't just soldiers to her. They were young people like her brother with families waiting for them to come home. She thought about Private Johnson's words about his buddies saving his life, and she knew she had to try something. Officer Riley was examining her damaged helicopter when Sarah approached her. "How bad is the damage?" Sarah asked quietly. Could it fly one more mission if it wasn't carrying much weight? Riley looked at her suspiciously. Maybe one short flight, but it's incredibly risky. The hydraulics are failing and I lost most of my communication equipment. Why are you asking? Sarah explained her idea. She wanted to take medical supplies directly to the trapped soldiers. Her plan was simple but dangerous. Use the damaged helicopter to fly low and fast to the locations where the soldiers were trapped. Drop emergency medical supplies and possibly evacuate the most seriously wounded. You're talking about a suicide mission, Riley said bluntly. Even if this bird could make it there and back, we'd be flying straight into a combat zone with no backup and limited communication. Plus, you're a civilian. I can't authorize taking you into a war zone. But Sarah had made up her mind. She had watched too many soldiers die because help couldn't reach them in time. Her brother had died because an ambulance took too long to arrive after his accident. She wasn't going to let that happen again if she could prevent it. Sarah spent the next hour preparing medical supplies for transport. She packed trauma bandages, blood clotting agents, pain medications, and IV fluids into lightweight bags that could be dropped from the air. She also prepared a small surgical kit in case they could land and provide direct medical assistance. Officer Riley initially refused to participate, but Sarah's determination was convincing. She pointed out that soldiers were dying while they debated protocol. Sometimes following rules meant watching good people die unnecessarily. Finally, Riley agreed to attempt the mission, but only if they could keep it secret until after it was over. They waited until Dr. Peterson was busy with patients before quietly moving the supplies to the helicopter. Sarah left a note explaining what she was doing and asking that her parents be contacted if something happened to her. She felt scared but determined as she climbed into the damaged aircraft. The helicopter struggled to gain altitude, with warning lights flashing on the instrument panel. Riley fought to keep the aircraft stable as they flew low across the desert toward the reported location of the trapped soldiers. They could hear gunfire in the distance as they approached the area. Sarah's heart pounded as they spotted the first group of trapped soldiers. They were taking cover behind damaged vehicles in a small canyon, with enemy forces positioned on the surrounding ridges. Riley managed to hover just long enough for Sarah to drop medical supplies near their position before enemy fire forced them to retreat. The second location was even more dangerous. The rescue team was trapped in a narrow ravine with steep walls on both sides. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves at both ends, creating a deadly crossfire zone. Riley tried to approach from different angles, but the helicopter was taking hits from ground fire. We can't get close enough, Riley shouted over the noise of gunfire and struggling engines. The supplies will scatter if we drop them from this distance. Sarah made a split-second decision that would define the rest of her life. She told Riley to get as close as possible to the trapped soldiers, even if it meant landing in the combat zone. Against her better judgment, Riley attempted to land the helicopter in a small clearing near the ravine, where the rescue team was trapped. The moment they touched down, Sarah grabbed the medical supplies and ran toward the trapped soldiers while Riley kept the helicopter running. Bullets whizzed past her head as she zigzagged across the open ground, using rocks and debris for cover. She had never been so terrified in her life, but she kept moving forward. She reached the trapped soldiers and immediately began treating the most seriously wounded. Corporal Martinez had a severe leg injury that was bleeding heavily. Staff Sergeant Thompson had shrapnel wounds to his chest and was having trouble breathing. Sarah worked quickly to stop bleeding and stabilize their conditions while bullets continued to fly overhead. The soldiers were amazed to see a civilian nurse in the middle of the combat zone. "What are you doing here?" Corporal Martinez asked through gritted teeth as Sarah worked on his leg wound. "My job," Sarah replied simply, focusing on applying pressure bandages and starting an IV line. She had brought enough medical supplies to treat multiple casualties, and she moved efficiently from soldier to soldier, providing emergency care that would keep them alive until proper evacuation could be arranged. The enemy fire intensified as Sarah worked. The helicopter's engines were failing rapidly, and Riley was struggling to keep the aircraft operational. Sarah knew they had only minutes before the helicopter would be completely disabled. Stranding them all in the combat zone, working under the most extreme conditions imaginable, Sarah managed to stabilize 4 seriously wounded soldiers and provide basic treatment to several others. Her training and experience allowed her to work effectively even while under fire, making quick decisions about priorities and treatment options. As the helicopter's final warning alarm sounded, Sarah made her last decision of the mission. She told the soldiers she had done everything possible with the supplies available, and that rescue would come soon. Then she ran back to the helicopter as enemy forces began advancing on their position. Riley managed to get the damaged aircraft airborne just as enemy fighters reached the landing zone. The helicopter limped back to base with multiple systems failing, and both women injured from flying debris. They crash-landed just inside the base perimeter as the aircraft finally gave up completely. Sarah stumbled out of the wreckage with cuts and bruises but refused immediate medical attention. Her first concern was organizing proper rescue operations for the soldiers she had just treated. The medical supplies she had delivered, along with the treatment she provided, had bought precious time for the trapped soldiers. Within hours, a full-scale rescue operation involving air support and reinforcements successfully extracted all the trapped soldiers. The medical care Sarah had provided in the combat zone had prevented what could have been multiple fatalities among the rescue team. But Sarah never spoke about what she had done that day. When asked about her injuries, she simply said there had been an accident with the helicopter. She filed no reports about the mission and asked Officer Riley to keep their actions confidential. In her mind, she had simply done what any nurse would do, provided medical care to people who needed it. The rescued soldiers began arriving at the medical tent within 6 hours of Sarah's secret mission. She worked alongside Dr. Peterson and the rest of the medical team, treating the men she had helped stabilize in the combat zone just hours earlier. None of them mentioned seeing her there, and she said nothing about her previous encounter with them. Corporal Martinez was the first to arrive. His leg wound, which Sarah had treated under fire, was properly bandaged and had stopped bleeding completely. Dr. Peterson examined the field dressing with surprise, noting the professional quality of the emergency treatment. Whoever worked on this knew exactly what they were doing, he commented to Sarah. This bandaging probably saved his leg. Sarah simply nodded and continued preparing IV medications. Keeping her expression neutral, she watched as Dr. Peterson examined each rescued soldier, mentally noting how her emergency treatments had held up during the evacuation. Staff Sergeant Thompson's chest wounds were stable, and the emergency decompression she had performed had prevented a collapsed lung from becoming fatal. As the medical team worked, Sarah listened to the soldiers describe their rescue. They spoke with gratitude about the mysterious medical supplies that had appeared during the firefight, and the unknown person who had provided life-saving treatment while bullets flew overhead. Several soldiers mentioned seeing a figure in civilian clothes moving between the wounded, but the chaos and poor visibility had made identification impossible. Someone risked everything to help us, Staff Sergeant Thompson told Dr. Peterson as his wounds were being cleaned. We were running out of hope when suddenly there were medical supplies and someone who knew how to use them. I never got a clear look at who it was, but they saved my life. Dr. Peterson asked the soldiers if they had any idea who might have provided the medical assistance. The soldiers described a person of average height who moved quickly and efficiently, working with professional medical skills. They assumed it was a combat medic from the rescue team, unaware that the official rescue had arrived hours after Sarah's intervention. Sarah felt conflicted as she listened to these conversations. Part of her wanted to speak up and share what had actually happened, but a larger part of her believed that seeking recognition would diminish the importance of simply helping people in need. Her brother had always told her that true heroism meant doing the right thing without expecting anything in return. Officer Riley had been treated for her injuries in a different section of the base and was scheduled for evacuation to recover from a concussion sustained in the helicopter crash. Before leaving, she approached Sarah privately and asked if she planned to report their unauthorized mission to the command. What we did probably violated about 20 military regulations, Riley said quietly. I could face court-martial if the truth comes out, but I want you to know that I don't regret it. Those soldiers are alive because of what you did. Sarah assured Riley that she had no intention of discussing the mission with anyone. As far as she was concerned, the helicopter had simply crashed during a routine reconnaissance flight. The medical supplies that had reached the soldiers could have come from any source, and there was no need to complicate the official reports. Over the following days, Sarah noticed increased attention from both medical staff and soldiers throughout the base. Word had spread about the mysterious medical intervention that had saved lives during the rescue operation. Some people speculated about which combat medic had been responsible, while others wondered if it had been a local civilian with medical training. Colonel Morrison visited the medical tent more frequently, speaking with the rescued soldiers and trying to piece together exactly what had happened during the firefight. Sarah could see that he was troubled by gaps in the official reports and inconsistencies in witness statements. As a commander, he needed to understand all aspects of the rescue operation to learn from the experience. "Doctor, I'm having trouble understanding the timeline of medical intervention," the colonel said to Dr. Peterson during one visit. The rescued soldiers received professional medical treatment before our official rescue team arrived. The quality of care they describe suggests someone with advanced training, but none of our combat medics were in position to provide that assistance. Dr. Peterson acknowledged the mystery, suggesting that perhaps one of the trapped soldiers had medical training they weren't aware of. Sarah continued working nearby, organizing supplies and checking on patients while carefully listening to their conversation. She felt the weight of her secret growing heavier each day. The rescued soldiers recovered quickly, thanks in large part to the timely medical intervention they had received. Private Collins, who had been part of the original patrol, approached Sarah as she was changing his bandages. He studied her face carefully, as if trying to remember something important. "Ma'am, I know this might sound strange, but you look familiar," Collins said thoughtfully. "During the firefight, when someone was helping the wounded, there was something about the way they moved that reminds me of you. Very calm and efficient, even under pressure." Sarah's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. She told Collins that all medical personnel were trained to work calmly under pressure, and that he had probably seen similarities in technique between different healthcare providers. She quickly finished changing his bandages and moved on to other patients, but Collins' comment worried her. If the soldiers began to suspect her involvement, it could lead to uncomfortable questions about military protocol and unauthorized actions. Sarah decided she needed to be even more careful about avoiding attention and keeping her secret safe. The base psychologist, Captain Davis, began interviewing soldiers involved in the rescue operation as part of standard post-combat counseling. Several soldiers mentioned feeling confused about certain details of their rescue, particularly regarding who had provided medical assistance. Captain Davis noted these inconsistencies in his reports, adding another layer of official curiosity about the unexplained medical intervention. Sarah volunteered for extra shifts and longer hours, partly to stay busy and partly to demonstrate her commitment to regular medical duties. She wanted to establish a clear pattern of normal behavior that wouldn't suggest any involvement in unauthorized activities. Dr. Peterson praised her dedication, unaware that she was trying to deflect attention from her heroic actions. During quiet moments, Sarah reflected on her decision to keep the mission secret. She thought about her brother, who had always believed that doing good work was its own reward. She also considered the potential consequences if the truth emerged: possible disciplinary action against Officer Riley, questions about civilian authority to take military action, and complications for the medical staff who hadn't been aware of her plans. The other civilian nurses, Maria and Jennifer, noticed that Sarah seemed more withdrawn than usual following the rescue operation. They invited her to join them for dinner and conversation, hoping to help her process whatever was bothering her. Sarah appreciated their concern but couldn't share the real source of her anxiety. 2 weeks after the rescue, Sarah received a letter from her mother containing newspaper clippings about the military operation. The story had reached civilian media, with headlines praising the successful rescue of trapped soldiers. The articles mentioned mysterious circumstances surrounding the medical care provided to wounded troops, but no details about Sarah's involvement. Her mother's letter expressed pride in Sarah's service and concern for her safety. She wrote about how the family was following news from Afghanistan and praying for all the brave people serving there. Sarah felt guilty reading her mother's words, knowing she couldn't share the full truth about what she had experienced. As time passed, Sarah began to believe that her secret was safe. The official reports had been filed without mentioning unauthorized civilian involvement, and the rescued soldiers had accepted the explanation that their medical care had come from unidentified military personnel. The investigation into the mysterious medical intervention seemed to be winding down, but Sarah didn't know that Colonel Morrison was still quietly investigating the incident. As the experienced commander, he recognized that something important was missing from the official reports, and he was determined to find the truth. His investigation would soon focus on the one person who had been carefully avoiding attention: the quiet civilian nurse who always seemed to be exactly where she was needed most. 3 weeks after the rescue operation, Colonel Morrison sat in his office reviewing incident reports late into the evening. Something about the official accounts didn't make sense, and his military instincts told him there was more to the story. He had built his career on attention to detail and understanding exactly what happened during military operations, especially when lives were at stake. The colonel spread out timeline charts, witness statements, and medical reports across his desk. According to official records, the rescue team had reached the trapped soldiers at 13:47 hours, but medical evidence showed that professional treatment had been provided to wounded soldiers before 1200 hours. There was a gap of nearly 2 hours that no one could explain. He picked up the phone and called Chief Warrant Officer Riley, who was recovering at a medical facility in Germany. Despite her injuries, Riley had been cleared for phone interviews about the helicopter crash that had ended her reconnaissance mission. The colonel had some specific questions about her flight path and timing. "Officer Riley, I need to clarify some details about your mission on the day of the rescue operation." Colonel Morrison began carefully. "Your helicopter was damaged during reconnaissance, but I'm having trouble understanding the exact sequence of events." Riley's voice was cautious as she responded. "Sir, my bird took hits during the surveillance flight. Hydraulics failed, and I had to make an emergency landing back at base. The helicopter was a total loss after the crash landing." The colonel noted something evasive in her tone. In his experience, pilots usually provided much more technical detail about aircraft failures. Riley's explanation was unusually brief and lacked the specifics he would expect from someone with her flying experience and professional reputation. "Can you walk me through the timeline more specifically?" he pressed. "When did you first observe the trapped soldiers, and how long did you remain in the area before returning to base?" There was a long pause before Riley answered. "Sir, the situation was very fluid. Multiple enemy positions, poor visibility due to dust and smoke. I provided reconnaissance information and returned to base as quickly as possible due to aircraft damage." Colonel Morrison sensed that Riley was being deliberately vague about important details. He made notes about her responses and decided to investigate from different angles. As a commander, he had learned that the truth usually emerged when you asked the right questions of the right people. The next morning, the colonel visited the medical tent and asked Dr. Peterson to review the medical evidence from the rescued soldiers. He wanted a professional opinion about the quality and timing of the emergency medical treatment that had been provided in the field. "Doctor, based on your examination of the wounded soldiers, what can you tell me about the medical care they received before reaching our facility?" the colonel asked. Dr. Peterson pulled out the medical charts and reviewed his notes. "The field treatment was exceptional, sir. Professional-grade bandaging, proper wound cleaning, correctly administered IV fluids. Whoever provided this care had advanced medical training and worked under extremely difficult conditions." The colonel studied the medical reports carefully. "In your professional opinion, could this level of care have been provided by standard combat medics with basic field equipment?" Dr. Peterson shook his head. "The techniques used suggest someone with nursing or doctor-level training. The precision of the IV placement, the wound assessment, the medication dosages. This was someone who really knew what they were doing. It wasn't basic first aid." This information confirmed the colonel's suspicions that someone with specialized medical training had been present at the combat zone before the official rescue team arrived. He began making a list of all personnel with advanced medical qualifications who could have been in the area during the relevant time frame. The colonel's investigation led him to review personnel records for all medical staff at the base. Sarah Martinez's file showed extensive emergency room experience and specialized trauma training from civilian hospitals. She had volunteered for deployment specifically to provide medical support in combat situations. Her qualifications were impressive and exactly matched the skill level that would have been required for the field treatment. But according to duty rosters, Sarah had been on base during the entire rescue operation. There was no official record of her leaving the medical facility or participating in any outside missions. The colonel noted this information but continued gathering evidence before drawing any conclusions. He decided to interview some of the rescued soldiers again, asking more specific questions about what they had observed during the medical treatment. Staff Sergeant Thompson provided the most detailed account of what he remembered about the person who had helped him. "Sir, I remember hands that were very steady, Even with all the gunfire around us, Thompson told the colonel, the person who treated my chest wound worked quickly but carefully, like someone who had done this kind of work many times before. There was something very professional about the way they moved. The colonel asked Thompson to describe anything else he could remember about his medical treatment. The soldier mentioned that the person had spoken very little but had given clear, calm instructions about how to position his body to help with breathing. The voice had been quiet and reassuring, even in the middle of the firefight. Colonel Morrison began to piece together a theory about what had really happened. Someone with advanced medical training had somehow reached the trapped soldiers before the official rescue team arrived. This person had provided life-saving treatment and then disappeared without taking credit or filing reports about their actions. The colonel's investigation took an interesting turn when he discovered maintenance records for the crashed helicopter. The aircraft had been scheduled for routine inspection the day after Officer Riley's reconnaissance mission, but the crash had made that impossible. He requested detailed technical reports about the helicopter's condition before and after the incident. The maintenance chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, provided disturbing information about the helicopter crash. Sir, when we examined the wreckage, we found evidence that the aircraft had been landed and taken off again before the final crash. There were impact marks and debris patterns that suggested multiple landings, not just the emergency landing that Officer Riley reported. This evidence suggested that the helicopter had been used for more than just reconnaissance before it crashed. The colonel realized that Officer Riley had not been completely truthful about her mission activities. He decided it was time for a more direct conversation with the pilot. When the colonel called Officer Riley again, he presented her with the maintenance evidence and asked for a complete and honest account of her mission. After a long silence, Riley finally admitted that she had not been alone during her final flight. Sir, I transported Nurse Martinez to the combat zone, Riley confessed reluctantly. She requested immediate transport to provide medical assistance to the trapped soldiers. I initially refused, but she was very persuasive about the need to help wounded personnel. The colonel felt a mixture of frustration and admiration as he learned the truth. A civilian nurse had convinced a military pilot to violate protocol and fly into a combat zone to provide medical assistance. It was exactly the kind of unauthorized but heroic action that created both problems and legends in military service. Why didn't you report this in your official statement? The colonel asked Riley. Sir, Nurse Martinez asked me to keep the mission confidential. She didn't want recognition for what she did, and she was concerned about potential disciplinary action against me for authorizing an unauthorized flight. I agreed because I believed what we did was the right thing, regardless of regulations. Colonel Morrison now had the complete picture of what had happened during the rescue operation. Sarah Martinez had risked her life to provide emergency medical care to wounded soldiers, working under enemy fire to save lives that might have been lost otherwise. Then she had returned to base and continued her regular duties without ever mentioning her heroic actions. The colonel sat in his office that evening, considering what to do with this information. Military regulations clearly prohibited unauthorized civilian participation in combat operations, but the results of Sarah's actions had been extraordinary. Multiple soldiers were alive because of her intervention. As a commander, he faced a difficult decision about how to handle this situation. He thought about the soldiers who had been saved by Sarah's actions, young men who would return home to their families because a nurse had been willing to risk everything to help them. He also considered the precedent that would be set by either punishing or recognizing unauthorized heroic actions. Colonel Morrison realized that some situations transcended normal military protocol. What Sarah Martinez had done represented the best traditions of military service, putting the welfare of others above personal safety and asking for nothing in return. It was time for the truth to be told, regardless of the complications it might create. Colonel Morrison spent 2 days considering how to handle the truth about Sarah Martinez's heroic actions. He consulted military regulations, spoke with his superior officers, and wrestled with the competing demands of protocol and recognition for extraordinary service. Finally, he decided that some acts of heroism were too important to remain hidden. The colonel arranged for a surprise gathering in the base's main assembly area, telling the medical staff and soldiers that he had an important announcement to make. Sarah arrived with Dr. Peterson and the other medical personnel, assuming it would be a routine briefing about base operations or new policies. As soldiers filled the assembly area, Sarah noticed that many of the men she had treated after the rescue operation were present. Staff Sergeant Thompson, Corporal Martinez, Private Collins, and others were seated in the front rows. She felt nervous without understanding why, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Colonel Morrison took the podium and began speaking to the assembled group. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you today about heroism and the true meaning of service. 3 weeks ago, we conducted a rescue operation that saved the lives of 16 soldiers who had been trapped in enemy territory. Sarah's heart began racing as she realized the direction of the colonel's speech. She glanced toward the exits, considering whether she could leave without drawing attention, but Dr. Peterson was standing beside her and blocking her path. The official reports of that rescue operation were accurate in most respects. The colonel continued. However, they failed to include one crucial element that made the difference between life and death for several soldiers. Today I want to correct that omission. The colonel gestured toward the rescued soldiers in the front rows. These men received professional medical treatment while under enemy fire, before our official rescue team could reach them. That treatment stabilized their injuries and kept them alive, during a critical period when minutes could have meant the difference between survival and death. Sarah felt the eyes of hundreds of soldiers turning toward the medical staff, and she tried to make herself invisible among the group. But Colonel Morrison's next words made that impossible. The person who provided that life-saving medical care was not a combat medic or military medical officer. It was Nurse Sarah Martinez, a civilian contractor who volunteered to fly into a combat zone, aboard a damaged helicopter to help wounded soldiers she had never met. The assembly area erupted in applause as soldiers turned to look at Sarah with surprise and admiration. She felt her face burning with embarrassment and wanted to disappear. But Dr. Peterson placed a supportive hand on her shoulder and smiled with pride. Colonel Morrison waited for the applause to quiet before continuing. Nurse Martinez convinced Chief Warrant Officer Riley to transport her to the combat zone, using a helicopter that was barely airworthy. She landed under enemy fire, moved between wounded soldiers while bullets flew overhead, and provided emergency medical treatment that saved multiple lives. Staff Sergeant Thompson stood up and began clapping again, followed by Corporal Martinez and the other rescued soldiers. Soon the entire assembly was on their feet, giving Sarah a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. She stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by the attention and recognition she had tried so hard to avoid. After completing her mission, Nurse Martinez returned to base and resumed her regular duties without filing any reports or seeking recognition for her actions. The colonel continued. She asked that her heroic service remain confidential, preferring to let others take credit for the lives she had saved. Dr. Peterson leaned over and whispered to Sarah, "I should have known it was you. You disappeared for several hours that day, and you had cuts and bruises that you couldn't explain. Why didn't you tell us what you had done?" Sarah shook her head, still unable to speak as the colonel continued his presentation. She had never wanted this kind of attention, and she felt uncomfortable being singled out when so many other people had contributed to the successful rescue operation. Colonel Morrison called the rescued soldiers to the front of the assembly area. One by one, they approached Sarah and thanked her personally for saving their lives. Staff Sergeant Thompson, whose chest wound she had treated under fire, had tears in his eyes as he shook her hand. "Ma'am, I knew there was something familiar about you," Private Collins said as he approached Sarah. "You saved my life that day, and I'll never forget what you did for us." The colonel presented Sarah with the Civilian Service Commendation, the highest recognition that could be given to non-military personnel for actions in support of military operations. He read the citation aloud, describing her courage and skill in providing medical care under extreme combat conditions. This commendation recognizes not only Nurse Martinez's technical medical skills, but also her moral courage in risking her own life to help others. Colonel Morrison announced, "She represents the best traditions of service and sacrifice, regardless of whether someone wears a military uniform." Sarah finally found her voice and asked to address the assembly. With shaking hands, she took the microphone and looked out at the hundreds of faces watching her with respect and admiration. "I want everyone to understand that I didn't do anything special," Sarah began quietly. "I'm a nurse, and nurses help people who are hurt. It doesn't matter where they are or how dangerous the situation might be. These soldiers risk their lives every day to protect others, and the least I could do was help them when they needed medical care." She paused, thinking about her brother and the reasons she had come to Afghanistan in the first place. My brother died in an accident because help didn't arrive in time. I came here because I never wanted to feel helpless again when someone needed medical assistance. What I did that day wasn't heroic. It was just my job. The assembly erupted in applause again as Sarah handed the microphone back to Colonel Morrison. She was crying now, overwhelmed by the emotions she had been suppressing for weeks. Dr. Peterson and the other medical staff surrounded her with hugs and congratulations. After the ceremony, Sarah returned to the medical tent to find it decorated with banners and flowers that soldiers had gathered from around the base. The rescued soldiers had organized a celebration in her honor, with food and music to thank her for her service. That evening, Sarah called her parents to tell them about the ceremony and the recognition she had received. Her mother cried with pride as Sarah described the events, and her father told her that her brother would have been proud of what she had accomplished. "You found a way to turn your grief into something positive," her father said over the scratchy phone connection. "You saved lives because you couldn't save his." That's exactly the kind of person he would have wanted you to become. The story of Sarah's heroic actions spread throughout the military community and eventually reached civilian news outlets. She received letters from families of the rescued soldiers, thanking her for bringing their sons and husbands home safely. Military medical personnel wrote to praise her example of dedication and courage. Sarah completed her deployment in Afghanistan with a new understanding of her own capabilities and purpose. She had proven to herself that one person could make a difference when faced with impossible circumstances. The recognition was nice, but more importantly, she had found peace with her brother's death by ensuring that other families wouldn't experience the same loss. When she returned to the United States, Sarah was invited to speak at nursing schools and medical conferences about her experiences. She always emphasized that heroism wasn't about seeking recognition or glory, but about being willing to help others when help was needed most. Years later, Sarah continued working as a trauma nurse, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply show up when others are counting on them. The soldiers she had saved in Afghanistan remained in contact with her, forming lifelong bonds forged in the crucible of combat and compassion. Colonel Morrison's decision to expose Sarah's heroic actions had given her something she never expected. Not just recognition, but a deeper understanding of her own strength and the difference one person could make in the lives of others. Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who never intended to be heroes at all, but who simply did what needed to be done when it mattered most.